Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, which is entitled 5 Tips to Author a GHS-Compliant Safety Data Sheet. Our goal today is with the pending release of GHS here within the U.S. and the current adoption in the EU is just to give you some things to think about today if you're have authoring material safety data sheets in your future. The session today, we hope to keep it at about 30 minutes of conversation, and then we'll leave some time at the end available for questions. If you do have a question, you can type that into the question panel within the webinar control panel, and we'll accumulate those and try to take as many as we can at the end of the session. You can expand and contract your webinar panel. You should see a orange button with a white arrow in it. You can push that to close the control panel and then push it again to open it back up. So today we have two guests from SiteHawk who understand safety data sheet authoring intimately. First we have Ruth Mayo, who is a regulatory compliance specialist and customer manager here at SiteHawk. And she has over 7 years of environmental industry experience and is responsible for the authoring work here at SiteHawk. And then we also have Scott Williams, who's the Director of Sales and has over 20 years of experience in the EH&S consulting and management field. And with his background in environmental and safety consulting, his role is to advise companies in the evaluation and selection of electronic chemical data management systems. So with that, I would like to introduce Scott and have him take it away. Scott?
Thanks, Craig. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. It's interesting. We decided to do this webinar based on our real-world experience in the authoring services business. Some of these tips that we're going to provide to you are going to be of real value and may not be the ones you expect. I do want to make a side note. It would be virtually impossible for us to give you enough tips to author a fully compliant document at the time we want to spend today, but what we do hope to leave you with are some specific pieces of information and resources that you can utilize as you deal with the changing regulatory environment, particularly related to authoring a compliant document in the new world that we see out there. And so, as Craig said at the end, we'll save some time for questions. Any questions that we don't get to, we will email a response to that requester, and we look forward to providing as much information as we can on this topic due to what's going on in the world. And with that, Ruth, I'm gonna turn it over to you, and we'll jump right in on the first tip.
All right. Yeah, that sounds good. All right, so in this tip, the first tip, we're going to review what data is necessary to author a compliant safety data sheet and where you may need to go to find that data. So first of all, go ahead and skip to the next slide for me. Before we review what data is needed, I want to cover some basic elements of the GHS first. So first of all, remember that GHS prescriptively lays out the methods for classification. In these methods, certain data points are necessary to appropriately classify substances for health, environmental, and physical hazards. And finally, GHS has specified rules for classifying mixtures based upon certain data points using concentration cutoffs and formulas. So if you skip to the next slide, here you'll see that these are the GHS health and environmental hazards. As I mentioned before, there are certain data points used to determine these classifications. For example, you use LD50 oral toxicity data to determine acute oral toxicity classifications, or germ cell mutagenicity data to determine mutagenic classifications.
What's interesting is in the new classification process, all of this data is going to be much more important to accurately create a compliant document.
That's right, because GHS has a prescriptive method for classification. Likewise, for physical hazards, there are also certain data points needed to classify materials. To determine flammability for liquids, for example, you need to look at the flash point as well as the boiling point data for your material. Flammability for aerosols, for example, looks at flame extension data to determine classifications. So, all of this to say, it's important to know what data points are necessary to appropriately classify your materials. And then last but not least are mixtures. And GHS utilizes a tiered approach for the classification of mixtures. So here you'll see the very first tier, you utilize material level data available for your mixture. If this information is not available, then you move to using bridging principles where applicable. So let's take a moment and kind of discuss what bridging principles are. Bridging principles are basic guidelines that can be applied to determine classifications for untested mixtures. So when a mixture has not been tested, that there's sufficient data on the components or on similar tested mixtures. This data can be used to estimate classifications for your untested mixture. And then finally, the last tier here is when material level data and bridging principles are not applied, then you move to this last tier where you use the hazard information available for your known ingredients to estimate health and environmental hazards for your mixture. Again, that's going to be based upon predetermined cutoffs and formulas. And this is actually the most commonly used tier in the mixture classification process, at least in my experience. It's the most common tier used. So now that we've covered the general GHS classification criteria, we can talk about what data needs to be collected. So first of all, collect material level data if it's available. Has physical property testing been done for your material, such as, do you have a flashpoint test available, or is there explosivity test data available? Maybe you have flame extension data available. Is there toxicity testing available? Have you done irritation testing? Or acute toxicity testing? Is there carcinogenic data available or mutagenicity data available? Something important to note here is the use of manufacturer knowledge. Many times your knowledge of your products can take the place of actual testing.
A good example of this, I believe, would be in our business, we occasionally get asked by companies that we're writing MSDSs for a test lab. And it's possible that testing isn't required if they have enough manufacturer information on the use or results of the use of that material to author the document. That's exactly right.
And then finally, is there ecological data available for your material? Perhaps you have aquatic toxicity tests available, or perhaps you have some bioaccumulation data available that can be used to classify your material. So now, at this point, you've determined where material level data is lacking for certain classification points. So the next step is to collect data based upon bridging principles where applicable. So you'll see here on this slide, there's just a few examples of bridging principles that you can utilize. Dilution, for example, is an example of a bridging principle where when a mixture is diluted with a substance that has an equal or lower toxicity, then the hazards for the new mixture is assumed to be the same as the non-diluted material. You can also use batching principles or substantially similar mixtures as bridging principles to, again, estimate hazards for your untested mixture. Whatever the case may be, you need to make these determinations and document this information for use when classifying your mixture. You may even need to document this information on the actual safety data sheet. And then finally, if material level data is missing and bridging principles cannot be used, you can then determine classifications based on hazards of known ingredients. So this means, first of all, you need to collect composition information for your products. And I see we're on another slide. Okay. First of all, do you have ingredient cast number information? Do you know the exact percentages for those ingredients as they are contained within your material? Exact percentages will allow you to provide the most accurate classification possible for your material. Also, you need to conduct ingredient research. You need to know the ingredient hazards for your material, or collect known toxicity information or known ecotoxicity information. Know what those LD and LC50 values are, or your LC and EC50 values are. All right, so now we know what data to gather. So where do you need to go to gather this data? Well, first of all, use internal resources. Perhaps you can go to your R&D department to determine some of this information, or you can go to chemists, engineers, EH&S specialists. All of these people are great places to start when looking for material level data. You can also use online resources. ToxNet is actually a free online resource which incorporates data for chemicals from multiple resources, including your IARC monograph, your RTEX data, the Merck index. That data is also included in the ToxNet resource. You can also use ISIS. ISIS is actually a European website. It stands for the European Chemical Substance Information System. And from this website, you can gather EU CLP classification information. You can also gather REACH registration information. You know, use the GHS Purple Book. It's available online as well. We're on the 4th revision of GHS right now, but all of the previous versions of the GHS Purple Book are also available.
I do know that you mentioned that some of these resources are free. There are also some that are subscription-based or you have to purchase the data.
That's exactly right, yeah. And a good example of this, Scott, is going to be the RTEX data. RTEX stands for the Registry of Toxicological Effects of Chemical Substances. And this is a great resource to use for toxicity data, including acute toxicity and CMR data. And we actually use that data here at SiteHawk for classification purposes. You know, at this point, you may also determine that testing is necessary, specifically to determine appropriate physical hazard classifications. And then finally, the last resource is use vendor MSDSs to determine hazards for your ingredients. This is especially important when you're using complex mixtures in your formulations. I know vendor MSDSs, a lot of times they're notorious for having data gaps or having not the most accurate information, but it's still a good place to start. And don't be afraid to go to those suppliers and ask them for information to close in those gaps where possible.
Yeah, and one thing that we anticipate over time as GHS becomes adopted here in the U.S. and integrated are pure gas. You know, as those raw material MSDSs of yours are classified appropriately, you'll be able to use that data for the classification and creation of your safety data sheets.
And then finally here, these are just some other points, data points that you may want to collect. For example, trade secret information. Perhaps you need to identify certain ingredients on your safety data sheets as proprietary. For EU and CLP safety data sheets, you need to know product restrictions and product uses. Transportation information and some other data you may want to collect. A lot of times you can determine GHS physical hazard classifications based upon that transportation information.
So we've been talking about the data that you need to collect and some of the complexity in classifying and the different levels of data that may be required for each of those. We'll step now into the second tip. And Ruth, you want to talk about that as well?
Absolutely. So with the second tip, this is where you need to determine and know the regulatory requirements for where you will be selling your products. So the first logical question is, where are you selling your products? You may wonder, first of all, why do I need to know this information? Well, it's really important because, first, countries and agencies can utilize the building block approach, which means that different countries and agencies have adopted GHS slightly differently. Also, countries can add hazard classifications in the form of supplemental information where there are gaps in GHS classifications in their current guidelines. Another reason is because different countries have different regulatory content requirements. There are also safety data sheet format differences from country to country. And finally, there are classification requirement differences across different agencies and countries.
And we're going to go into each of these just a little bit more in depth, correct?
That's exactly right. So let's take the first one here, which is the building block approach. And again, this is where countries and agencies have the option to adopt only those portions of the GHS that fit within their current regulatory framework. OSHA, for example, is going to be implementing the building block approach. They have stated that they're going to be adopting all GHS hazard categories except for acute toxicity category 5, skin corrosion irritation category 3, aspiration category 3, and they're not going to be adopting any of the environmental hazards. Well, the EU in their new CLP regulation is also implementing the building block approach. So here you can see a comparison of the GHS hazard categories and the EU CLP categories. So here you can see, just like in the United States, the EU CLP is planning on only adopting for acute toxicity categories 1, 2, 3, and 4. They're not going to be adopting category 5. Likewise, skin corrosion irritation, they're adopting hazard categories 1 and 2. They're not adopting category 3. So countries can also add additional hazard categories not yet covered by GHS in the form of supplemental information. The reason GHS allows for this is because the GHS may not be covering all the hazards that an agency or regulatory body thinks should be covered, or is not covering certain hazards that are or were covered under their guidelines. So for example, there's a lot of talk out there that OSHA is going to be adding an additional hazard category for combustible dust. The EU, in their CLP regulation, has also added their own EU H statement. For example, here you see on the screen the EU H001 hazard statement for explosive when dry. This was actually an R phrase under the old EU directive. And because GHS did not have a comparable classification or H statement, the EU has added their own to the CLP regulation. Now, the EU is also adding more than just this one hazard statement. If you go to the next slide here, you'll see
a couple, right,
just a few. So you'll see here that this slide lists all of those EU H statements that they're going to be adding. So countries also have their own regulatory content requirements. You need to know what these are and have sources to obtain this information. For example, EU member states have their own exposure limits for different chemicals, and you must represent that information on your safety data sheet if it's applicable. You also need to have a resource to determine inventory list information. You know, are all of your ingredients on the TSCA inventory, for example? Or did you know that the Philippines have their own inventory list? So if you're selling in that country, you need to ensure that you have a resource to pull in that data on your safety data sheet. Also, different countries have their own pure substance hazard classification lists. Japan has their list of 1,500 chemicals, as does the EU. I'm sure you are all familiar with Annex 6. And you're required on EU CLP safety data sheets to indicate the Annex 6 classifications for each of your ingredients in the component section of the safety data sheet. Also, some countries have their own disclosure list. Canada, for example, has an ingredient disclosure list where you're required to indicate certain ingredients on the document at certain percentages.
And that list is called?
The ingredient disclosure list. It's real complicated. All right, and so the next thing here is that countries may have their own safety data sheet format requirements. The EU CLP REACH safety data sheet format is actually slightly different than the GHS 16 section safety data sheet format. So here you can see on this slide we've represented the UN GHS 16 section safety data sheet in the specified order. Well, a CLP safety data sheet must have subsections with specified names, and then must also be numbered to meet REACH requirements. Also, there can be no null data fields on an EU CLP document, and you must indicate reasons for not indexing or classifying, and they actually suggest using a hazard grid to communicate this information in Section 11 of the safety data sheet. So here you can see an example of the EU CLP REACH safety data sheet sections and numbered subsections. You'll see here that this only covers sections 1 through 5, but just keep in mind that all 16 sections of a CLP safety data sheet are broken down into numbered subsections. So this slide right here is an example of section 2 of a CLP safety data sheet. On this slide, you're going to notice a couple of things. First of all, you should notice the numbered subsections. So you'll see here subsection 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3. Another thing that you'll notice are both new EU CLP classifications as well as older EU preparation directive classifications. This is actually a requirement to include both old and new classifications for mixtures until the EU transition period is over in 2015.
What's interesting, at the bottom of this slide, I see that you also have UN GHS classifications. And as Ruth mentioned earlier, with various agencies having adopted different building blocks, it's possible that you'll see safety data sheets with multiple agency classifications on them so that they can be compliant in various parts of the world, which is our recommended approach for authoring a compliant document.
That's right. And then here you have this slide is an example of what Section 11 may look like under the new EU CLP format. You'll notice here the table where all GHS classification properties are listed with the resulting classification. And where no classification is provided, the use of the appropriate terminology is being used. So you'll see classification criteria not met, or you'll see the use of data lacking. That term is being used. So it may be that specific verbiage is necessary to use for certain countries' safety data sheets, in addition to just the format being different. And then finally, different agencies and countries may have their own classification requirements. So here's 4 very broad examples of this. The EU, they actually utilize different cutoffs than GHS for classification purposes. Mexico has actually recently adopted GHS into their NOM regulation. And in Mexico, GHS is not required, but it's optional at this particular point in time. China and Japan, they have both integrated GHS into their regulations kind of in their own way, and they put their own little spin on it. So it's important to know what these differences are so that your safety data sheets are compliant in these countries.
Which takes us to our third tip. Hopefully we're providing additional small tips along the way, but our third major discussion point is we recommend developing an internal document review process to ensure that your SDSs are complete and accurate and compliant. And the process there is we believe that you should communicate internally the complexity and the need for resources for creating that accurate and compliant SDS. As you can tell from some of the different data points and different classification processes and building blocks out there, regulatory content, it is a different new world to create a compliant document. And by creating or communicating that appropriately and understanding what resources you need, you're able to be much more effective in creating that compliant document in a timely manner. So determine who internally and externally can provide that required data. Ruth mentioned earlier the chemist, the quality engineer, any of the developers of your product, or the external resources that provide your raw materials. Are important to understand who can get that information for you in that review process. Assign different groups and resources to different sections of the STS for review and completion.
Yeah, and this is actually probably one of the most difficult things that I personally deal with for our authoring services customers. Many times the customers, after we provide them with the first draft, they're not sure who in their organization they need to send that draft to for review. And because of that, many times documents are not finalized in a timely manner.
It's interesting. There are many elements of an organization that are involved in creating a document, because these documents become more and more a business-critical piece of information. In fact, it may be a differentiator for your organization with the new sustainability rules that are out there. So having a compliant, accurate document that has your branding, that may include marketing, it may include quality, it may include your research scientists, or even engineering and sustainability. Understanding those groups and resources who may be important for completing various sections of the STS are very important. The next recommendation is a pretty standard one, and it's to set deadlines. Ruth mentioned it earlier that there are many times where we submit a draft and it takes quite a bit of time to get the final review process because of the various people involved. So understand that setting a deadline and having an opportunity to meet that is important. What you don't want to happen, which we've heard happen, is a shipment of product being sitting on a freight dock somewhere waiting to be shipped because there's no compliant SDS available. At that point, it becomes an expensive scramble to get that SDS done with the information necessary. The last point is to have a point person responsible for that review process and final approvals. By having a point person who can manage the process, you're able to be much more efficient and track down the information and resources necessary to create that compliant document and get it out the door.
All right, so I'm going to take tip number 4 here. This tip says have a controlled change management for your documents. You know, this is especially important to ensure that there's not different versions or older versions of the same document being circulated to your customers. So first of all, ensure your regulatory sources have a way to manage and assess content changes and updates. You know, sometimes I feel like regulatory lists are being updated every other day, it seems like. And during this time, regulatory changes are occurring more and more frequently. So you need to make sure your regulatory resources are up to date so that the most current information can be represented on your safety data sheet. Another thing here is make sure you know what constitutes a minor change versus a major change. You know, this is especially important because there are certain downstream obligations you have when dealing with the major change, and your document needs to be updated. Here in the United States, you have 90 days to ensure that that new document is provided to your downstream users. So, you know, typically formulation and regulatory changes are considered major changes, which may constitute a new safety data sheet version being published. Synonym changes or other editorial changes may not be quite as important. But whatever the case is, you need to ensure that everyone in your authoring department or in your company is aware of these decisions to ensure consistency in updating and versioning your safety data sheet.
Probably not so great a story, but it's interesting. We author many, many documents. Is involved in more than 1,000 a year, I'm sure, hands-on herself. And we received a request to author a document from a customer recently, and found out that document was coming back to us in a different format from what we created initially less than a year ago. And that was the most current document they felt at the time in their organization. So it happens more often than we realize, that having a document control process to ensure that a document that represents your company, that represents risk for your organization, isn't out in the wild, and that the proper compliant SDS is what's being provided to your customers is a very important part of this overall changing regulatory climate.
That's exactly right. And then finally, when changes are necessary, ensure that they are done within a document update process, and do not allow for changes outside of this process. This is going to minimize different versions of the same document being provided to customers, and it's going to reduce liability for your company.
So that will take us to the fifth tip. And the question there is, decide whether you prefer to use a software or a third party, an outside resource for authoring SDSs. Internal resources are available as well in many companies in today's world. But from what I've heard from Ruth and what I've seen in our organization and the industry as a whole, that it's going to become a much more difficult part of business to have an internal resource or resources that can meet the changing regulatory climate and create compliant documents in an efficient, effective manner. Some of the questions that we would recommend asking are, for an internal resource, do you have the expertise and do you have the necessary regulatory resources available? Again, we don't know if it's the best option. It's something you would definitely want to ask yourself. If so, can you utilize resources like a software, which would be one of our recommended tips, or a third-party resource for authoring documents. Again, questions that we would ask from software, if you're reviewing software for your authoring needs, is, do you have the time to learn the application? As you can tell, rules-based classifications are complicated and changing. Does the software keep up with the changing regulatory environment? Our resources utilized, when we say resources, mean the regulatory content, RTEX data, toxicity information, things along those lines. Are they being utilized, and more importantly, how are they being updated so that as change occurs, and for example, here in the U.S., you have to communicate that change within 90 days to your customers. Is that being updated in your system? And if so, is that being communicated so that you can update your safety data sheet in a compliant manner?
That's right. Something else you may want to consider in terms of software is there translation capability with that software program? You know, with safety data sheets needing to be sent all across the globe, specifically in Europe, you're required to submit that safety data sheet in the language of the member state that you're selling your product into. So you need to ensure that there are translation capabilities within that software program that you're using.
Absolutely, absolutely. And from the third-party perspective, utilizing an outside source to author documents, do they have the expert necessary? If the third-party resource asks for a formulation only, my recommendation would be to look at some additional resources, because to author a compliant document, for example, in you need to know the product uses and think along those lines. There are nuances to authoring a document to be compliant and to reduce risk for your company that are generally often required in a more in-depth manner than just a formulation. are they asking the questions to understand how your products are being used, what they are, what their end use is, and how they may be used? Those type of questions and that communication back and forth with a third-party vendor for authoring are very important. If you're going to utilize that resource as opposed to an internal resource, that line of communication has to be open and not limited.
That's exactly right. Actually here, it's actually really important. A lot of times the way your product is being used is going to impact other sections of the safety data sheet, such as, you know, what personal protective equipment is necessary or what the appropriate engineering control measures are necessary. So it's extremely important to have that open dialogue.
And the same situation applies in third party as it would for software, and what regulatory resources are being used, and do they have a source of regulatory update and content update for when the UN Purple Book changes, and the downstream effects of that result in building block changes in the EU CLP classification process, or when EU lists a new H phrase.
There you go.
Then that type of information is important and may impact the classification of your document, which would then need to be updated. So with that, we're going to jump right into the conclusion and wrap up to make sure we reiterate what we've talked about. We'll have a few questions to answer. It looks like we've had several good questions that have come in over the webinar. As we mentioned, gather the data that's important. Understand what that data is, know what that information is, and how you're going to classify your materials is a very important part of authoring, and gathering that information is a very time-consuming process unless you know where you can put your hands on it. Second, know the regulatory requirements. Understand the regulatory environment, the building blocks, the area of the world that you're shipping your product to, and have the resources available so that you can obtain that appropriate classification or regulatory content. Third, develop a document review process. Understand that there are internal resources that need to be involved in that, and ensure that the appropriate people are reviewing and signing off on that document and providing the information necessary, and have that point person to formalize the process and to set deadlines and follow up on those. The fourth tip was to control change management for your documents. We strongly encourage that you don't have materials in the wild that sales guy gets hold of and modifies, tweaks, because that could be risk for your company or risk for your client. And the fifth tip is make a decision on using software or an authoring service provider, or if you go with an internal resource to utilize software that includes regulatory content change and updates and notifications, so that as the regulatory climate is modified, your safety data sheets can be modified as well. And with that, I thank you, Ruth and Craig. We're going to jump into some questions and see if we can get an answer on those. I'm going to ask these of Ruth. She is our expert. I'll probably get a better answer from her than me anyways. So first and foremost, one of the questions is, can you still use, this fairly technical question, can you still use the article exemption under GHS?
Yeah, that's a good question. For this specific question, the GHS actually gives that responsibility to the competent authority. It is my understanding that here in the United States, OSHA is not planning on changing their definition of an article exemption. So what we're doing now in terms of articles not being necessary to create safety data sheets, and they're currently exempt, we do anticipate that to stay the same when OSHA publishes their final rule.
Thanks, Ruth. Here's another question. Are you aware of any online or site courses that specialize in MSDS authoring?
That's another really good question. You know, here at SiteHawk, we use several resources for our continuing education program. We actually utilize an organization called the SCHC, the Society for Chemical Hazard Communication, and they offer courses in safety data sheet authoring, in GHS classification, in EU CLP safety data sheet authoring. So that's a really great resource that can be used.
Thanks, Ruth. It looks like we have time for just a couple more questions. What sources do you recommend for toxicity data?
That's a good question. Again, I kind of mentioned this in our presentation that we use RTEX, the Registry of Toxicological Effects of Chemical Substances, for our toxicity information. Again, you can also use vendor MSDS information for that. Yeah, that's about it.
Okay. Here's a question that gets asked often in many different webinars and discussions. What is the latest update on GHS adoption in the U.S.? I'll jump on that one simply because the last change we heard happened on my birthday, which I believe was in late October. The final rule was sent to the OMB. They have 90 days to act on that and to either publish it out to the Federal Register or send it back for additional review. So our assumption is that if things go as planned, sometime early in 2012, the final rule will be published in the Federal Register, and then the transition period will begin immediately after that and should last somewhere between 2 and 5 years, depending on what the final rule says as it comes out. And so I think we're about out of time. Is that right, Craig?
Okay, great. And Scott, we'll assume that was your 28th birthday that you celebrated. But I'd like to thank first Ruth and Scott for sharing the information today, and we'd also thank the audience for joining us today. Obviously, there's a lot of considerations to think about on the topic. We provided what we could in the time allotted, but there's a lot more detail that's out there. What we will do is we will provide a link to both the PowerPoint and the recorded webinar out to all of the attendees, and we'll do that within the next day or two. And then for any unanswered questions that we did not address here in the webinar, we'll make sure that we send a follow-up response to address those questions as well. So again, thank you for your attendance and have a great day.